They say superheroes do not exist, but a poor boy, abandoned, entered the war at 17 and faced an entire army alone. Wounded, on top of a burning tank, he did not retreat. This is not a movie. This really happened. And the name of that Captain America was Audie Murphy. Before the legend existed, before the medals, before the newspapers called his name, there was only a forgotten boy in the middle of nowhere. A boy who was not born with a grand destiny, who received no special opportunity, who had no one opening doors for him. On the contrary, everything around him seemed to push him toward failure. And perhaps that is exactly what makes this story impossible to ignore. Because when the world creates a man like Audie Murphy, he does not begin as a hero. He begins as a survivor. Audie. Leon Murphy was born on June 20th, 1925, in Kingston, Texas. But it was not the Texas of the movies. It was not the Texas of legendary cowboys or vast ranches. It was a dry, hot, harsh, silent place. A place where poverty was not a phase. It was a permanent condition. His family lived in a simple cabin, without comfort, without security, without any guarantee of food the next day. His father was a sharecropper, a man who worked on someone else's land and received only a portion of what he produced. In practice, that meant working all day, just to remain poor. Audie was the seventh of 12 children. 12 kids growing up in an environment where there was not even enough for one. From a very young age, he understood something many people spend their entire lives without realizing. No one was coming to save him. There was no plan B, there was no support system. There was only raw reality and the need to survive. Childhood for him was not made of play. It was made of labor. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade, not because he wanted to, but because he had to help his family eat. In the cotton fields, under the heavy Texas sun, he worked for $1 a day. When there was work. When there was not, the day ended with nothing. No money, no food, no hope. And it was in this setting that he learned a skill that would later save his life countless times. Hunting. But it was not hunting as a sport. It was not leisure. It was survival. When Audie went out with a borrowed rifle or even just a simple slingshot, he was not thinking about fun. He was thinking about bringing food home. Many times, he had only one bullet, a single chance. Missing was not an option. Missing meant his family would go hungry. And it was this way, still a child, that he developed an almost instinctive precision, a coldness that did not come from courage, but from necessity. But if life was already hard, it was about to get worse. In 1936, when Audie was only 12 years old, his father simply disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye. One day he was there, the next he was gone, and he never came back. That was not just a physical abandonment. It was the moment Audie realized that from then on, responsibility was no longer shared. His mother was left alone to care for 12 children. 12. Trying to survive through temporary jobs, domestic work, and any opportunity that appeared. It was a daily struggle against the impossible. And then came the blow that would change everything. In 1941, at 16 years old, Audie lost his mother. Josie Belle Murphy died exhausted, consumed by a life that had been too hard. And with her death, the family fell apart. The younger siblings were sent to an orphanage, separated, scattered. And in that moment, Audie made a silent promise. A promise no one heard, but one that would guide everything he did from that point on. He promised that one day he would get them out of there. But at that moment, he was alone. No parents, no stable home, no education, no prospects. He managed to get a job at a radio repair shop, earning $16 a week. It was little, very little, but it was everything he had. And it was there, on what seemed like an ordinary day, that he heard the news that would change his life forever. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack was not just a historical event. For many, it was the beginning of a war. But for Audie Murphy, it was an opportunity. It may sound strange, but for someone who had already faced abandonment, hunger, loss, and desperation, war did not seem like the worst possible scenario. On the contrary, it looked like a way out, a path, perhaps the only one. And this is where the question begins to take shape. How does an undernourished boy, barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighing just over 110 pounds, with no formal education, become the most decorated soldier in the history of the United States? The war can transform ordinary men into something completely different. But in the case of Audie Murphy, that transformation began long before the first shot was ever fired. It began the moment he made a decision that most people would never fully understand. The decision that he would not be left behind, not by circumstance, not by poverty, not by rejection, not even by a system that clearly told him he did not belong there. Because after Pearl Harbor, while thousands of young Americans rushed to enlist, driven by a wave of patriotism, for Audie, it was something far deeper, something more personal. He was not just answering a national call. He was chasing something he had never truly had. A purpose, a place in the world, a way out of a life that seemed already written in struggle and limitation. But there was a problem that stood in his way. A problem that for most would have been enough to end the story right there. He simply did not look like a soldier. Standing at barely 5 feet 5 inches and weighing just over 110 pounds, he was seen as too small, too light, too fragile. And when he tried to enlist in the Marines, he was rejected. When he tried the paratroopers, he was rejected again. And even the Army did not see in him a combatant. They saw an undernourished boy trying to enter a war that did not seem meant for him. But what none of them could see, what none of them could measure, was that Audie Murphy had already been fighting a war long before World War II had even begun. And because of that, because of everything he had already endured, he was not built to accept a no. So he made a choice that would change everything. He lied, with the help of his older sister, who signed documents altering his age. Officially, he was 18. In reality, he was 17, still a boy by every definition, but carrying the weight, the scars, and the mindset of a man who had already faced survival at its rawest level. And on the day he finally managed to enlist in the United States Army in 1942, there was nothing about him that suggested history was about to be written. No imposing presence, no visible sign of greatness, just a small frame and a mind sharpened by hardship. And yet, that was precisely what would set him apart from everyone else. When he was sent to training in North Africa, he stepped into a world completely different from anything he had known before, an environment defined by relentless heat, strict discipline, and physical demands that broke many recruits before they ever reached a battlefield. For most, it was a shock to the system, a brutal introduction to military life. But for Audie, it was simply another challenge, another situation where survival depended on adaptation. And almost immediately, something about him began to stand out. Not because he was louder, not because he was stronger, but because of what he did not do. He did not complain. He did not hesitate. He did not look for ways to avoid the difficulty, while others focused on doing just enough to get through the day. He consistently pushed further, doing more, learning faster, adapting quicker. And it did not take long for his superiors to notice this unusual behavior. In fact, one officer, looking at his size and physical appearance, suggested that he be reassigned to safer duties, something behind the lines, something like a cook or a baker, a role where his chances of survival would be significantly higher, because from the outside, he did not look like someone built for direct combat. But Audie's response was immediate and unwavering. He refused without hesitation, because he was not there to be safe. He was there to fight. And that single decision, simple on the surface, would ultimately define the path he was about to walk, because from that point forward, he fully embraced the reality of what was coming. And during training, he developed an almost obsessive relationship with weapons, especially machine guns, spending extra hours at the firing range long after others had left, refining his accuracy, studying the behavior of each weapon, understanding every detail, every recoil, every limitation. It was not just practice, it was preparation, as if somewhere deep inside, he already understood that one day he would be alone in a situation where there would be no second chances, just like in his childhood when he hunted with a single bullet. Except now, the difference was undeniable. The target would shoot back, and as the days passed, his fellow soldiers began to notice that there was something different about him. Not arrogance, not recklessness, but a strange, almost unsettling calm. An absence of panic that is rarely seen even among experienced soldiers, as if he existed in a state where fear had already been processed long before the war began. And that is what made him unique. Because while most men learn to deal with fear, Audie Murphy seemed to arrive already prepared for it. But even with all of that, something was still missing. Something that no training could replicate. The moment when everything would stop being theory and become reality. The first combat. The first time pulling the trigger against another human being. The moment when survival would no longer be a concept, but a necessity again. And when that moment finally arrived, there was no hesitation, no pause, no second thought. And it was exactly at that point that this story stopped being about potential and began to transform into something far greater. The first combat is the moment that separates training from reality, the line between what a man believes he is capable of doing and what he actually does when death is standing right in front of him. And up until that point, Audie Murphy was just another soldier inside a massive structure, someone who showed discipline, skill, and an unusual level of composure, but who had not yet been tested in the only environment that truly matters in war. And that test came in Sicily in July of 1943, when the 3rd Infantry Division landed on enemy territory for the first time. The heat was suffocating, the terrain uneven, and the tension hung in the air like a constant warning that any movement could be the last. Murphy was only 17 years old, a small body by military standards, but a mind already shaped by years of survival. And during a reconnaissance patrol, he spotted 2 enemy officers trying to escape on horseback, a situation that lasted only a few seconds, but would define everything, because most soldiers hesitate in that moment. They think about consequences. They feel the weight of what they are about to do. But Audie Murphy did not hesitate. He raised his weapon and fired. taking both men down without any sign of doubt, and when questioned later by his commander about the coldness of his action, his answer was simple, direct, and revealing of how he now saw the world he had entered. He said that it was their job. There was no emotion in his response, no attempt to justify or soften what had been done, only the acceptance that from that point forward, that would be his reality. And it was exactly in that moment that something became clear to everyone around him. Murphy was not just participating in the war, he was adapting to it in a way that very few could. But war does not only reveal, it also demands, and it demands in a ruthless way. Still during the Sicilian campaign, Murphy contracted malaria, a disease that weakens the body, drains energy, and can remove any soldier from the front lines for a long time. And for someone with his already limited physical structure, that could have meant the early end of his active participation in combat. But as soon as he was able to recover even slightly, he refused any possibility of being permanently removed and returned to his unit, once again proving that for him, leaving the war was not an acceptable path. And then came Italy, a battlefield that raised the level of brutality to something many soldiers would never forget. Unlike Sicily, where the advance still carried some offensive momentum, Italy was harsh, mountainous, covered in mud, constant rain, and heavily fortified defensive positions held by the German army. It was the kind of environment where every meter gained cost lives, where the enemy could be just a few meters away, invisible until the moment of fire. And it was in this scenario that Murphy began to stand out consistently. During a night patrol along the Volturno River, he and two other soldiers were ambushed. The first shot killed one of them instantly, turning the situation into complete chaos. And while many soldiers would have retreated or taken immediate cover, Murphy did the opposite. Alongside the remaining survivor, he advanced toward the enemy position, using grenades and precise fire to eliminate 5 German soldiers and completely break the ambush. And that was not just an act of courage, it was a demonstration of control under extreme pressure, something that was quickly becoming a pattern in his behavior. As the Italian campaign progressed, Murphy began volunteering for missions that most avoided, especially night patrols, reconnaissance operations, and actions in areas where direct contact with the enemy was all certain. And in Monte Cassino, one of the bloodiest points of the entire war in Europe, he further solidified his reputation. There, among ruins, mud, and constant artillery fire, Murphy showed that his calm in combat was not situational, it was part of who he had become. During one particularly critical mission, his unit was trapped in an abandoned quarry with no advantageous position and under constant enemy pressure, a situation that would normally end in surrender or total destruction. But Murphy organized an effective defense, positioning his men strategically and coordinating fire in a way that completely reversed the scenario. The Germans, who initially had the advantage, began to suffer losses, lost control of the situation, and were eventually forced to retreat and surrender. And this kind of outcome was not common. It was not expected. And it began to create a perception within the unit that Murphy was not just a good soldier, but someone capable of changing the course of a battle. In another action, he advanced under enemy fire across open ground, eliminating enemy positions that were blocking his company's advance, ensuring the continuation of the operation. And these actions earned him promotions and decorations. But more important than that, they earned him something that cannot be formally awarded: the absolute trust of his fellow soldiers. By 1944, Murphy carried out one of the actions that best demonstrated the level of risk he was willing to take, destroying a German tank using rifle grenades, which required him to get dangerously close, at a distance where any mistake meant immediate death. There was no real cover, no guarantee of success, only the necessity to act. And he executed it with precision and survived, receiving one of his first major decorations for bravery. But at that point, the medals were no longer the most important factor. What was being built was something far more significant, a reputation spreading through the division, the image of a soldier who did not retreat, who maintained control when others lost it, and who took responsibility when the situation demanded it. His superiors began to recognize him not only as an efficient combatant, but as someone with natural leadership in extreme situations. His fellow soldiers looked at him as a reference, especially in the most critical moments when fast decisions and precise actions made the difference between life and death. And perhaps the most impressive detail of all is that while accumulating experiences that many soldiers would not face in an entire career, Audie Murphy had not yet turned 18, and the war continued to advance. The battles intensified, and everything he had faced up to that point, as brutal as it seemed, was still not the limit of what was yet to come. By this point in the war, Audie Murphy was no longer seen as just a promising soldier or someone who had a few standout moments in combat. He had already moved through scenarios that broke more experienced men, faced situations that would normally end in death or retreat, and still continued to move forward. What once looked like isolated episodes was now clearly forming a consistent pattern. Murphy was not just surviving combat, he was mastering it, and it was in France, during Operation Dragoon, that this pattern reached an entirely new level. In August of 1944, Allied forces landed in southern France to open a new front against the German army, increasing pressure on an enemy already being forced to retreat on multiple fronts. And Murphy, now carrying more experience than many soldiers older than him, was at the front line of that advance. He was 19 years old, but his decisions and movements reflected the confidence of someone who had already faced death repeatedly and learned not to hesitate in front of it. And in the days that followed the landing, he led his unit through a series of confrontations against fortified German positions in mountainous terrain where the defensive advantage was entirely on the enemy's side. These were difficult engagements where every advance required precision, coordination, and above all, the willingness to expose oneself to enemy fire. And in one of these encounters, Murphy found himself facing a numerically superior force, around 20 German soldiers positioned with a clear advantage. The situation was simple. Retreating would preserve lives in that moment, but it would also mean losing ground and allowing the enemy to reorganize. Advancing meant accepting extreme risk, and Murphy chose to advance. Using the terrain, rapid movement, and precise fire, he eliminated 6 enemy soldiers, wounded others, and captured 11, almost single-handedly, neutralizing a position that could have significantly delayed the advance of his entire unit. And this action not only impressed his superiors, but earned him the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration in the United States. For most soldiers, receiving such an honor would mark the peak of a career. For Murphy, it was just another step in something that was still unfolding. But war does not allow stability. Every victory is followed by another confrontation. Every advance brings new challenges, and that is exactly what happened. During the Battle of Montélimar, still in France, Allied forces were attempting to encircle a large, retreating German column, creating a strategic opportunity to weaken the enemy significantly. The combat was intense, prolonged, and extremely exhausting. And Murphy was at the center of it, advancing under constant artillery fire and machine gun bursts coming from elevated positions. And it was in this environment that he suffered one of his first serious wounds. hit by mortar fragments. The explosion threw him to the ground, causing intense pain and limiting his mobility. And for most soldiers, that would mean immediate evacuation and a long period away from combat. But for Murphy, it was only a temporary interruption. As soon as he was able to recover, even minimally, he refused to remain away and returned to the front lines before full medical clearance, reinforcing a pattern that had already become clear. He would not accept being away from the fight while his men were still in it. And as Allied forces continued advancing toward northeastern France, the battles became even more complex. Near the town of Cleury, Murphy led one of the most remarkable actions of his trajectory up to that point. His unit needed to capture a heavily defended quarry, a strategic position that blocked movement in the region. The location provided excellent cover for the enemy, who used machine guns and elevated positions to control any attempt of approach. Instead of launching a conventional attack, Murphy analyzed the terrain and identified a weakness in the German defenses, and he led a coordinated assault combining frontal pressure with an improvised flanking maneuver, completely surprising the enemy. The position was taken, and the Allied advance continued. And this action was later highlighted by superior officers as an example of exceptional tactical leadership, something not expected from such a young officer, especially someone who had started the war as a rejected recruit. Shortly after, in October of 1944, Murphy faced yet another situation that would further strengthen his reputation. During an advance, he was hit by a German sniper, the bullet striking his hip and dropping him instantly. And for a brief moment, it seemed that the sequence of extraordinary actions might have reached its end. But before even being removed from the line of fire, Murphy did something that would become characteristic of his path. Even wounded, he located the sniper's position and responded with a single precise shot, eliminating the threat. He was then evacuated for treatment. But as he had done before, he returned to combat as soon as he had the minimum conditions to do so. The pattern repeated itself again: injury, recovery, return, as if the war could not continue without him, or as if he himself could not accept existing outside of it. And it was during this same period that Murphy received a promotion that symbolized not only his performance, but also the official recognition of everything he had demonstrated so far. He was promoted to second lieutenant on the battlefield, a rapid rise, especially considering his age and background. At 19 years old, he was already leading men in situations where decisions had to be made in seconds, and where any mistake could cost lives. And perhaps the most impressive detail of all is that even before the event that would make him legendary, Murphy had already built a combat record that few soldiers achieve in an entire lifetime. Decorations for bravery, multiple wounds, participation in decisive campaigns, and a reputation that spread across his division. He was already, at that point, a phenomenon within the war, but something was still missing. The moment that would transform that phenomenon into something greater, something that would go beyond the battlefield and enter history permanently. Because what happened in January of 1945 was not just another act of courage, it was something that completely challenged the limits of what a single man could do in combat. It was the moment when Audie Murphy stopped being just an extraordinary soldier and became a legend. January 1945. European winter, intense cold, snow covering the ground, and a war that had already consumed millions of lives, yet was still far from over. In northeastern France, near the Colmar region, the situation was critical. German forces, even under pressure, were still capable of launching violent counterattacks, attempting to regain strategic positions and delay the Allied advance. It was in this scenario that Audie Murphy found himself at the center of one of the most improbable and decisive moments of his entire trajectory. Company B, to which he belonged, had been virtually destroyed. Out of roughly 200 men, only 18 remained fit to fight. 18 exhausted soldiers, wounded, worn down by months of continuous combat, facing an enemy that was numerically far superior and better equipped at that specific moment. On January 26th, at around 2 in the afternoon, the attack began. 6 German tanks advanced along the main road, followed by approximately 250 infantry soldiers. It was an overwhelming force, a level of superiority that, under normal circumstances, would make any attempt at resistance practically impossible. Murphy, now in command of what remained of his unit, made the logical decision. He ordered his men to retreat to a nearby tree line, where they would have some cover and a better chance of survival. It was the correct decision, the decision of an officer who understands the value of preserving lives in the face of an impossible threat with the available resources. But then, he did something that completely defies conventional war logic. He stayed. While his men retreated, Murphy remained alone in the open field. Near his position, an American tank destroyer had been hit and was burning. The vehicle, loaded with ammunition and fuel, could explode at any moment, turning into a deadly trap for anyone nearby. Even so, Murphy ran toward it. He grabbed the field radio and began coordinating American artillery fire, directing strikes against the advancing German forces. At the same time, he used his rifle to try to hold back enemy soldiers who were getting closer and closer. But that would not be enough. Not against tanks, not against hundreds of men. And then, he made the decision that would change everything. Murphy climbed onto the burning tank destroyer. On top of the vehicle, there was a .50 caliber machine gun, a weapon capable of causing devastating damage, but one that also left him completely exposed. Without protection, without cover, with enemy fire coming from multiple directions, he began to fire. Each burst was precisely aimed, every movement calculated, every second a fight against time, against fire, against the constant possibility of death. The vehicle beneath him was burning. The flames were growing, and at any moment, the ammunition could detonate. Even so, he remained there. What happened in the following minutes defies any attempt at simplification. For more than an hour, Audie Murphy, alone, wounded in both legs by shrapnel, held his position against the advance of 6 tanks and hundreds of enemy soldiers. He alternated between firing the machine gun and adjusting the radio, coordinating artillery strikes that landed dangerously close to his own position. At one point, the situation became so extreme that he informed the artillery that the strikes could be made almost directly on top of him. Such was the proximity of the German forces. There was no margin for error. There was no room for retreat. There was only the decision to continue. The Germans advanced, pulled back, tried to reorganize their positions, but were constantly held back by that single point of resistance. The machine gun remained active, interrupting movements, causing casualties, creating confusion. Time passed, and what should have been a rapid advance turned into an unexpected stalemate. Murphy was alone, delaying an entire offensive. When the machine gun ammunition finally ran out, he climbed down from the burning vehicle. Wounded, exhausted, with compromised legs, he walked back to the position where his men were. And instead of ordering a full retreat, he did something even more unexpected. He led a counterattack. Those 18 soldiers, who minutes earlier had been retreating to survive, advanced once again under his leadership. And the Germans, who had total superiority, began to retreat. That day, Murphy was responsible for eliminating or incapacitating dozens of enemy soldiers, practically alone, using a combination of direct fire and artillery coordination. But more than numbers, what truly matters is the impact of that action. He did not just survive an impossible situation, he completely changed the outcome of a confrontation that, under normal conditions, would have been a clear defeat for his unit. When later asked how he managed to do it, his answer was simple. He said he was just trying to prevent his friends from being killed. There was no heroic speech. There was no attempt to glorify the act. Just a direct explanation, almost unsettling in its simplicity. Months later, on June 2, 1945, Audie Murphy received the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration of the United States. He was 19 years old with a combat record that already placed him in a unique position in military history. By the end of the war, he would accumulate 33 decorations, including international honors awarded by France and Belgium. He participated in campaigns across multiple countries, spent hundreds of days on the front lines, and was credited with neutralizing approximately 240 enemy soldiers. But even with all these numbers, all these medals, and all this recognition, there is one point that remains stronger than any statistic. That day, in Holtzwihr, it was not just a soldier fighting against impossible odds. It was the moment when real history produced something that feels like fiction. It was the moment when Audie Murphy ceased to be just a highly trained man and became, definitively, a legend. When the war ended, Audie Murphy returned home as something few men in history had ever become. Not just a veteran, not just a survivor, but a symbol. His name no longer belonged only to military records. It began to circulate in newspapers, magazines, and conversations across the country. In July 1945, his face appeared on the cover of Life magazine, accompanied by the title that officially placed him in a unique position in American history, the most decorated soldier of the nation. That image was not just a photograph, it was the construction of a myth. For a country that had just gone through a devastating war, Murphy represented everything people wanted to believe in: courage, resilience, victory. But what few realized at that moment was that behind that image, there was a man who still carried everything he had lived through, without fully knowing how to deal with it. It was that same magazine cover that caught the attention of one of the biggest names in Hollywood at the time, the actor James Cagney. After seeing Murphy's image, Cagney decided to contact him, offering an opportunity that, at first glance, seemed completely out of place for someone who had spent years on the battlefield. The movies. The transition seemed unlikely, almost disconnected from the reality Murphy knew, but it also represented a chance to build a new life far from the war. Murphy accepted. However, the beginning of this new phase was far from glamorous. Unlike the image the public was beginning to form, his arrival in Hollywood was marked by difficulties, uncertainty, and a slow adaptation to an environment completely different from the one he had known in recent years. In the early days, Murphy faced a harsh reality. With no acting experience, no formal training, and no strong connections within the industry, he had to start almost from scratch. There were moments when he slept on the floors of gyms without enough money to maintain a stable routine. The initial partnership with Cagney, which seemed promising, did not materialize as expected, and Murphy once again found himself in a familiar situation, alone, without guarantees, and forced to find his own path. But just as he had done in the war, he did not retreat. Gradually, he began to land small roles, learning in practice, observing, adapting. The environment was different, but the mindset was the same. Move forward, improve, persist. In 1949, Murphy published his autobiography, To Hell and Back, a direct and honest account of his experience in the war. The book quickly became a success, capturing the attention of a public that wanted to understand what had truly happened on the battlefield. The narrative was not romanticized. It was not built to glorify. It was a raw description of real events, written by someone who had lived through each of them. The success of the book opened the doors for a film adaptation, and in 1955, something rare happened. Audie Murphy played himself in the movie. He relived his own story on screen, recreating moments that, for most people, were difficult even to imagine. The film became one of Universal Pictures' biggest successes at the time, establishing Murphy as a well-known figure beyond the military world. Over the years, he would appear in 44 films, many of them within the Western genre, which dominated cinema at the time. He became a familiar face to audiences, a recognized actor, someone who seemed to have fully transitioned from soldier to celebrity. Beyond cinema, he also became involved in music, writing songs that would be recorded by well-known artists. The image that was forming was that of a man who had succeeded on every front: war, fame, recognition, success. In many ways, he was the perfect representation of the so-called American dream. But there was a difference between the image and the reality. On the outside, Audie Murphy seemed to have left the war behind. On the inside, the war never left him. While the public watched his films and saw a hero on screen, Murphy still carried memories that could not be turned off, scenes that repeated, sounds that returned, situations that did not fade with time. The environment had changed. The clothes were different. The people around him were not the same, but the experiences he lived through in the war remained intact within him. And that created a silent division, almost invisible to those looking from the outside. On one side, the actor, the hero, the symbol. On the other, the man still trapped in everything that had happened. This duality became more evident as the years passed. The same man who was applauded on screen struggled off it, dealing with something that, at the time, still did not have a clear name, was not widely understood, and was often not taken seriously. Society saw the hero, but not the cost of becoming one. And Murphy, like many other veterans, had to deal with it almost entirely on his own. What the public saw was the mask. What he lived was another story. And that story, silent, intense, and often invisible, would become the most difficult battle of all. There is a kind of war that does not end when the last shot is fired. A war that does not depend on territory, has no maps, no clearly identifiable enemy uniforms. A silent, constant war that follows the soldier even after he returns home. For Audie Murphy, that war began when the other one ended. And unlike the battles he fought in Europe, this one could not be won with strategy, courage, or precision. Because now, the enemy was not in front of him. It was inside him. At that time, there was no clear name for what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. The terms used were vague, often minimized: battle fatigue, shaken nerves, expressions that did not capture the complexity or depth of what was really happening to those men. Society expected soldiers to return home and simply move on, as if it were possible to switch off everything they had lived through. But the mind does not work that way. And Murphy began to realize this in the hardest possible way. The nights became a constant problem. Sleep, which should have been a moment of rest, turned into a battleground. Frequent, Vivid, repetitive nightmares brought the war back with an intensity that felt real. Explosions, screams, gunfire, everything returned as if it were happening again. And for someone who had lived through it so directly, there was no clear distinction between memory and reality during those episodes. Murphy began sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow. Not as a symbolic gesture, but as a real response to a threat that, to him, still existed. His personal life began to reflect this internal conflict. Accounts from people close to him describe episodes in which he reacted during sleep as if he were still in combat, even pointing weapons without full awareness of what he was doing. During the day, the effects did not disappear completely. There were moments of irritability, difficulty concentrating, a constant tension that would not fade. The war had shaped his ability to react under pressure, but it had also left marks that were not visible. And perhaps the most complex aspect of all was the contrast. The same man who was seen as a symbol of absolute control in combat was facing an internal reality where that control was not always possible. In addition to the direct psychological effects, Murphy also developed a dependence on sedative medications used in an attempt to control insomnia and reduce the intensity of the nighttime episodes. It was a partial solution, a way to deal with the symptoms without addressing the cause. Over time, the dependence became a problem in itself. In a moment of clarity, he realized he could not continue that way. Instead of seeking conventional help, he made an extreme decision. He isolated himself in a hotel room and went through withdrawal alone, facing the effects without direct medical support. It was another battle, unlike any other, with no visible enemies, no military strategies, just pure endurance. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this phase is not only the suffering he endured, but what he chose to do with it. At a time when speaking about mental health was often seen as a sign of weakness, Murphy chose to make that struggle visible. He began to publicly advocate for veterans, drawing attention to the need to recognize and treat the psychological consequences of war. He used the visibility he had built throughout his career to give voice to a reality many preferred to ignore. In interviews, events, and public statements, he addressed the issue directly, without trying to soften or hide what he had lived through. This position was not common. Many veterans chose silence, either due to lack of understanding or fear of judgment. Murphy did the opposite. He brought the subject to the center of the conversation, anticipating a debate that would only gain strength years later, especially with the return of soldiers from other conflicts. In that sense, his actions beyond the battlefield had an impact that goes beyond his own story. He helped create space for others to be heard as well. And here lies a contrast that completely defines this phase of Audie Murphy's life. The man who had faced tanks, machine guns, and nearly impossible situations in war struggled to deal with something that could not be seen, measured, or fought in the same way. There was no way to eliminate this enemy with a precise shot. There was no way to advance or retreat strategically. It was a constant presence, a permanent reminder of everything that had happened. The public image remained intact. The war hero, the actor, the symbol of courage. But behind that image, there was a far more complex reality, a continuous, silent struggle that few could fully perceive. And this may be one of the most important parts of the entire story, because it reveals something that goes beyond Audie Murphy. It reveals the human cost of war, a cost that does not end on the battlefield. And while the world saw a hero who seemed to have overcome everything, the most difficult battle was still being fought. As the years passed, The image built around Audie Murphy began to face something no hero can completely avoid: time. The film industry was changing, the audience was changing, and the space that once seemed guaranteed started to become unstable. The Western genre, which had sustained much of his career, began to lose strength, making room for new styles, new narratives, and new faces. Murphy was still working, still appearing in productions, but the consistency that had marked his rise was no longer the same. The flow of opportunities decreased, and with it, the stability that cinema had once provided. At the same time, another problem was quietly growing, but with increasingly visible consequences. Gambling. His involvement with betting, perhaps initially seen as entertainment or distraction, evolved into something more serious. Financial losses began to accumulate. Risky decisions became part of his routine, and his economic situation, which was not as solid as it appeared on the outside, began to deteriorate rapidly. In 1968, Murphy declared bankruptcy. For someone who had been a symbol of success, both military and professional, this moment represented a significant rupture. It was not just a financial issue. It was another sign that life outside the battlefield did not follow the same logic he had mastered during the war. Even so, despite concrete difficulties, Murphy maintained a principle that reveals much about his character. He refused offers to promote cigarettes and alcoholic beverages, even when he needed money. In a scenario where accepting such work could have eased his financial situation, he chose not to associate his image with products he considered inappropriate, especially for young audiences. This decision did not generate headlines, did not bring immediate recognition, but it reinforces a consistent aspect throughout his life, an internal code he followed even when there was no practical advantage in doing so. In the final years of his life, Murphy began giving interviews more frequently, often reflecting on his own trajectory. In one of these moments, he made a statement that directly and powerfully summarizes his relationship with everything he had lived through. He said that the only thing he had ever found easy to do was war, and even so, war was something terrible. This sentence carries significant weight because it reveals not only his skill in combat, but also his understanding of the cost of that skill. There was no romanticizing, no attempt to turn war into something positive. There was recognition. Life outside the battlefield never followed a stable pattern. There were moments of success, recognition, professional achievements. But there were also instability, financial difficulties, and a constant struggle with internal issues that never completely disappeared. Murphy continued to be seen as a hero, but his personal reality was far more complex than that image suggested. He was not a distant, untouchable figure. He was someone who, despite everything he had done, faced very human challenges. And perhaps this is one of the most important points of this phase of the story, because it shows that extraordinary achievements do not guarantee a simple life afterward. The ability to face the chaos of war does not automatically translate into the ability to deal with the structures of civilian life. They are different realities, different demands, different contexts, and Murphy, like many other veterans, had to navigate this scenario without a clear guide, without a defined path. As the years moved forward, the intensity of his wartime story remained a constant contrast to the present. What he had done never ceased to exist, never lost its relevance, but it was also not something that could be repeated, adapted, or used in the same way outside that specific context. It was part of him, but it was not enough to define everything. And so, the journey of one of the most extraordinary soldiers in history moved toward its final chapter. Without major announcements, without preparation, without knowing that the end was closer than anyone could imagine. On May 28, 1971, the story of Audie Murphy came to an end, in a way as unexpected as many of the moments that had defined his life. There was no battlefield, no confrontation, no tactical choice or decision under pressure. Just a flight, a routine trip, a business journey that carried no sign it would be his final moment. Murphy was aboard a private aircraft, crossing the skies of Virginia, heading toward the city of Roanoke. The weather, however, was not favorable. The mountainous region of Craig County was covered in dense fog, drastically reducing visibility and turning the flight into a risky passage. At some point along that route, the aircraft lost enough visual reference to maintain safe navigation. Without adequate visibility and surrounded by elevated terrain, the pilot was unable to avoid impact. The plane crashed into the side of a mountain. There were no survivors. All 6 occupants died at the scene. Audie Murphy was 45 years old. The war, which had defined much of his life, was not what took him. The end came in silence, far from the sound of gunfire, far from the environment where he had always seemed to find control. The news of his death spread quickly. For many, it was difficult to associate that ending with someone who had survived such extreme situations. A man who had faced tanks, machine guns, ambushes, and direct combat, yet lost his life in an air crash during peacetime. This contrast reinforces a recurring element in his story: unpredictability. Nothing in his life followed a common path, and the ending would be no different. On June 7, 1971, Audie Murphy was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, one of the most symbolic places in the United States for military memory. He received all the honors due to someone with his record, official recognition, military presence, institutional respect. But there was one detail that drew attention. Traditionally, the graves of Medal of Honor recipients receive a special gold leaf finish, a feature that distinguishes them from others. Murphy's family made a specific request that his headstone remain simple, without any visual distinction separating it from the rest. This detail may seem small, but it carries significant meaning. In a place where thousands of soldiers are buried, each with their own story, their own path, their own contribution, Murphy did not want, even after his death, to occupy a space that placed him above others. His grave remains discreet, aligned with the others, as if he were just one among many. And at the same time, that simplicity contrasts with everything he represented. Over the years, his grave has become one of the most visited in Arlington, second only to that of President John F. Kennedy. People from different generations continue to go there, not just to see the site, but to acknowledge the story connected to it. It is not just a physical place, it is a symbol, a point of connection between what was lived and what is remembered. The death of Audie Murphy does not only mark the end of a life, it marks the closing of a journey that moved through different phases, different contexts, and different realities. From a boy who grew up in extreme poverty in Texas, to the soldier who accumulated a record number of decorations, to the actor who brought his own story to the screen, to the man who faced internal battles that few could see. Each of these phases forms a narrative that cannot be reduced to a single aspect. And perhaps the most significant part is realizing that despite everything that happened, despite all the achievements, despite all the recognition, the end came in a simple, silent way, without spectacle, just like the headstone that marks his final resting place. But even with that ending, the story does not end here. What remains of Audie Murphy is not just the medals or the numbers. It is the complete journey, from a boy who grew up with nothing to reaching a level no script could ever truly imagine. A soldier who did not just fight, but changed the course of entire battles, and who, even after all of that, returned home carrying a war that never truly ended. Because that is the part that does not appear in the movies, the part that turns this story into something greater than fiction. Audie Murphy was not a perfect hero. He was a real man who faced the extreme and lived with the consequences of it. And perhaps that is exactly what defines his legacy. Not only what he did in the war, but the weight of everything that came after. Because in the end, his story does not prove that heroes are invincible. It proves that they are human.